prejudice, the data and the evidence that SAGE is getting, both on the spread of the virus and the extent to which we get it down, well below the level R1, we'd be prejudging the decision that we need to take. And likewise, the evidence SAGE is getting is constantly informing, it's an iterative process, the options that we've got. So what I've tried to do is be as upfront as possible and set out the principles, if you like, the 5 principles that can give, I think, a bit of hope to the country, and also to say, come on, we've got to keep this up. What you're doing is working. I think we can see the signs of that, notwithstanding the death toll, which is a huge tragedy for so many people. But we must stay the course, and if we let up now, it would be, as Sir Patrick has explained, damaging for public health, but also damaging for the economy. It's not a trade-off here. If we get a second peak, it's not just damaging for people's health and for public safety. We'll also end up back in a second lockdown, which would prolong the economic risks. So we're taking the right decision at the right time, as we've always said. And the truth is, if I start giving you artificial and arbitrary time frames, it would be the irresponsible thing to do, and I can't do that. Tom Clark from ITV.
Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. In yesterday's press briefing, Professor Whitty, when asked about how we should manage this next phase of the outbreak, that data that SAGE needs that you're talking about, he said one bit of information that would be really useful is serology data. Namely, this is the survey data of blood supplies from the country to get a sense of how much of the population has been infected with the virus, and therefore how many may be immune to it. The PHE labs in Porton Down have tested more than 3,000 samples from that survey, but the results have yet to be published. Is that because, as I understand it from scientists who are familiar with the work going on there, that these tests are not delivering reliable results, either because of the tests themselves or because of what's going on in the immune systems of people who are being infected? And where does that leave us in terms of figuring out how big a potential second peak or how long we have to stay in a lockdown situation is? Are we currently flying blind?
Thank you, Tom. I'll let Chris address that.
Thank you. So serology data is going to be absolutely critical for a whole lot of reasons. The most important of which at this point of the epidemic is to work out what proportion of people look as if they have been infected. We have a kind of crude estimate, but that's a way of measuring it directly. It will in the longer term also probably be important in understanding our options for example, getting a vaccine. And it may also be useful in very longer term to provide evidence that someone has actually had an infection and they remain immune if the tests are reliable. Now, that's why it's important. You're absolutely right that there is a lot of work not just going on in Porton Down, to be clear. There are now substantial bodies of work in the academic sector, in Public Health England, and in many commercial areas, because everybody wants to have an accurate serology. And there are several different ways of approaching this, and different people are going down different groups. Broadly, there are 3 things that have slowed us down to date. The first of which is we don't yet have a serological test which we can put a lot of reliance on, although it can give us a ranging shot, and we do expect to have really quite crude early data, but that definitely needs to be improved on. The second thing is that we don't yet have a good sampling, what's called a sampling frame in epidemiological terms, and what we're trying to do is get that set up across the country so that we have a wide view about what's happened in this infection in various areas. But the third thing, which is just a fact of biology, is that it takes probably at least 21 days for the tests to be reliable. So you're always looking back in time on this, and early data will therefore be, because looking back in time 21 days, the epidemic was at a much earlier stage before we've reached the evidence of the beginning of a peak, which Sir Patrick talked about. That is a very different stage of the infection, and the data will become more useful over time. But we're moving very fast in this area scientifically, but we are definitely not there in either of the issues of getting the serology or getting the sampling frame. But we probably will have a crude ranging shot fairly soon. That's the consensus of the scientists involved.
Tom, that gives you a pretty detailed answer. Is there anything you wanted to come back on?
That's a very detailed answer. I just have one follow-up though. An interesting addition today to the data. We've got this all cases addition to the number of cases, so that's outside of the hospital setting. It looks like that's going to be very important. Is it going to change SAGE's predictions of how the peak is manifesting itself and what is happening with R? Specifically, are we seeing faster transmission, for example, in the care home setting at the moment, and that's something we're now going to have to factor in to any next phase response?
Patrick, I'll let you address that one.
Well, as I said before, I think it's very important to have the hospital death rate and the total death rate. It's worth remembering again that the ONS rates are people who've got COVID on their death certificate. It doesn't necessarily mean they were infected, because many of them haven't been tested, so we just need to understand the difference. In terms of the SAGE view, the SAGE view is looking at the R of the transmission in the community, and I don't think any of those data change that opinion as to where the R is. As I've said, it's not true that the R is necessarily below 1 in every hospital or in every care home, and that's the important area that we now need to look at and make sure that that the appropriate measures are in place to try and reduce the R there, but it doesn't change the overall view that I've described, that the R overall is below 1, and therefore we expect to see the slowing and the turn of the epidemic.
I think Chris wanted to just add something.
Yeah, so just on top of what Sir Patrick said, the ONS data, of course, tells us not only the people who are diagnosed as having COVID on the death certificate, with a diagnosis, some of which is on a basis of tests, some on the basis of the fact the doctor thought it was likely but not definite. But it also gives an indication of what's called excess mortality, the difference between the normal death rate, sadly at this time of year, and what we got at the moment. And that's been changing over time. And there are some additional deaths on top of the ones that you would expect for this time of year. So in the last week for which we have data from ONS, 3,475 people were diagnosed as having COVID, some of them from in-hospital, some of them from out of hospital. But the excess mortality was, in terms of the period as a whole for that week, was, depending whether you compare it to the week before or at the same week last year, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people. Now there's a gap between those. Now that could be just random variation. But one of the things that we've said from the beginning is that people die for many reasons in epidemics. They include the direct cause of death, but they can also include people who died, for example, if they stayed at home because they were worried that going into hospital was dangerous for them, and actually they have a heart attack or a stroke or something important like that. And the reason I'm making this point, other than just to clarify the data, is it is really critical for people to realise if they're having a medical emergency, we really appreciate people taking pressure off the NHS for the less urgent things, but if they're having a medical emergency, a heart attack, a stroke, a really bad flare-up of asthma, things like that which could be life-threatening, one of the things that the British public have done by taking the pressure off the NHS by staying at home, and my remarkable colleagues in the NHS have done by building up NHS capacity, is we've always maintained the ability to handle emergencies, whether COVID or not. And I really want to encourage people that if they have other medical emergencies, the NHS is open for business. And we really must encourage people who are having these life-threatening or life-changing things to go to hospital, go contact NHS 111 where that's necessary, because what we would be very sad to have a situation where people's activities and the NHS had managed to preserve the ability to do emergencies and people were not coming forward.
Tom, thanks very much. Sam Coates from Sky News.
Dominic Raab, Sky Analysis has found that 70% of frontline health and social care staff who died from coronavirus were from a non-white, a BAME background. Now, people in that community are very worried. They know you're having a review because you've announced it, but what specifically can you say to help them? Is the government on their side? What is your message for that community? And to Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, Dominic Raab just said that we could eventually relax in some areas and strengthen the lockdown in others. But every time older people hear things like that, they get worried, seeing everybody else as the priority. There's a perhaps justified fear that they might be kept indoors until there's a vaccine, which might be 18 months. They are worried that they might never see their grandkids for at least another year. What's your message to them at this anxious time?
Well, Sam, first of all, on your first question on the BME or any other demographic breakdown of the data, I think I'm going to defer to Patrick in terms of the analysis of that. But absolutely, we're on the side of anyone. Frankly, this coronavirus doesn't discriminate, but we will want to follow very carefully any of the analysis of the data in the way you described. And on your second point, and I'll certainly let Patrick and Chris comment, what I said was measures could involve various different permutations, some going stronger, some easing off. We haven't made up our mind on any of that, but our priority has been to safeguard life. One of the things that the British public have been very effective in doing is denying coronavirus, their means to spread. And of course we know that the data shows very clearly that those who are older or have a pre-existing condition are particularly vulnerable. So far from wanting to take measures which disproportionately prejudice them, we want to take measures which safeguard them. And that's been the guiding principle in relation to anyone who's particularly vulnerable to the coronavirus throughout this crisis. I don't know whether Chris or Patrick...
I'll take the second question, then Chris, I think you might take the one on ethnicity. On the second one, our aim is very clear, which is to get the numbers down now, and that means the social distancing measures that are in place need to stay in place in order to reduce the numbers of people with the infection in the community. That allows that's because the R comes down, but it's also the absolute number that needs to come down. So we've got fewer people carrying the infection. Once we're at that stage, then you can start to think about which are the measures that make most sense to release in order to not have another growth and put the R above 1. And in doing so, the aim there is to try and do that in a way that allows everything to start moving more towards normal, not to segregate on certain groups and so on, and say that there is a differential approach to this. Now, it may be necessary when you look at different jobs and different things to think about how you do that in a way that's safe. But the aim, certainly, in terms of how we're viewing it from the scientific angle, is to try to understand the basic principles that reduce transmission and allow the policymakers to take those basic principles and apply them in a number of different settings.
So it's absolutely critical that we find out which groups are most at risk so that we can help to protect them. And obviously there are three things which are really clear, and ethnicity is less clear. The three things that are very clear are age, and that's one of the reasons it's so critical to protect older citizens. People who've got comorbidities, people who've got more than one other disease, things like cardiovascular disease. And if you look at the ONS data on this, over 90% of people who have sadly died of this had at least one other disease. Many of them had more than one. And actually male sex is a very clear risk factor for reasons that are not absolutely clear. Being a member of an ethnic minority group is less clear, and we both looked, and I've had discussions with scientists about this in terms of trying to tease this apart today, also looking very specifically at healthcare workers with leaders of the NHS and across the medical and nursing professionals, because this is something we are very keen to get extremely clear. We've asked Public Health England to look at this in some detail, and then what we really want is, if we see any signal at all, we want to then know what next we can do about it to minimise risk. But to be at this point in time, whilst the age, comorbidity and gender is clear, this is not yet clear in terms of ethnic minorities, and we need to look at this more carefully and get this right.
Sam, would you like to come back on any of that?
Just one thing, it sometimes feels like ministers, number 10, are trying to pretend that there isn't a debate about what happens next, but you only have to pick up a paper or look at a TV broadcast to see plenty of people speculating about the what next and the easing of the lockdown. Is it really wise and sensible for ministers to almost absent themselves from the field in this debate, given that it's happening anyway?
I don't think we can be accused of absenting ourselves from the debate. We turn up to these Downing Street press conferences. I've set out the 5 principles. I've also explained why I know means we always want to tease out what the next question is that needs to be answered, but why it would be irresponsible for us to set out in either more detail the measures that are being considered as potential options, or indeed the time frame, because we don't have the data yet from SAGE. So we'll continue to be guided by the principles we started with, that is, follow the scientific evidence, take the right decisions at the right moment in time, and I think I addressed that fully in my remarks. Ben Kentish from LBC.
Thank you. First Secretary, you said today that the spread of the virus in the community is because of the sacrifices people are making on the way down, but in care homes and hospitals, it's on the way up. Whether that's because of a lack of protective equipment, a lack of testing, or another reason, would you accept that the measures in place in those settings have proved inadequate? And what will you do to make sure that some of the most vulnerable people in the country aren't put at further risk in places where they ought to feel safe? And if I could just ask Professor Whitty, you talk very openly there about the indirect costs, the indirect deaths that arise effectively as a result of the lockdown. I'm really interested to know whether you've modelled that, whether you're able to put a number on what would be expected. And some scientists have warned that in time those deaths will outweigh the deaths from the virus itself. Are you confident that we're a long way from that point, and are you able to say when it might come? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, so first of all, the coronavirus doesn't spread in a uniform, consistent way. And so you're absolutely right, we've made progress. I think Patrick and Chris have set that out. But in terms of care homes, we're absolutely gripping this. The Home Health Secretary on Wednesday set out a plan, and you asked in particular what's the detail of what we're doing. That the plan was to make sure that all care home residents and staff with symptoms will be tested, that all patients discharged from hospital will be tested before going into care homes. Care homes are being supported with different mechanisms to order PPE quickly. We had a local resilience forum drop to deal with distribution to care homes, obviously dispersed more widely than hospitals. We've had one last week, we've got another one this week. We're working up the Clipper service, which will regularise and expedite the distribution more generally. We've got the plan to expand the workforce in care homes to 20,000 through a new recruitment campaign and new guidance to minimise the spread of the infection. So we recognise that the virus hasn't spread uniformly. We're absolutely committed to making sure wherever it's reared, it is being tackled and it's targeted as management expectation. Patrick, did you get the second one?
Me first, but Patrick might want to add to that. I've said from the early on, you're absolutely right, that indirect deaths, we need to think about an indirect other illness. Death is not the only thing. If someone has had, for example, a major operation postponed, that also is something that we need to remember and take account of. So just to remind people, the four things I've laid out are direct deaths from the coronavirus, indirect deaths because the NHS emergency services are overwhelmed, and because of what the British public have done, and because of the fantastic work of my NHS colleagues, we have not come close to that, and we do not intend to come close to that. But the two other forms are indirect deaths because the NHS is reoriented towards COVID-19, and therefore less able to do other things that are not necessarily so urgent but are very important. And then finally, we know that anything that increases deprivation can in the long run cause issues. And we are absolutely looking at how these work and how they interact, because in coming to the next phase of this, we need to take account of all of those rather than just think about the direct COVID deaths, because if we just thought about those, we could end up having a much less targeted reach monthly goals and satisfy management expectation. Indirect causes, and this is actually something which SAGE, which Patrick chairs, has looked at in some detail and will continue to do so. Patrick, you want to add to that?
We look at it, and just to reiterate the point I made earlier on, at the moment this is not a tension between the economy and health. It's very clear what we need to do now, which is to keep this down, stop this from coming back again, stop a second wave, which would need a second lockdown if that occurs, and make sure that we get things down to a level where this is manageable. So those two things are not in conflict at the moment, but yes, we do absolutely look at those long-term consequences and modelling that and thinking about what the implications of that is.
Ben, would you like to come back on any of that?
Yes, if I may, just on the care home point, First Secretary, it would seem the new measures that were introduced this week were recognition that
you will be expected to reach monthly goals and 达到满足 satisfy management expectation.
Well, I noted that
You will be expected to reach monthly goals and satisfy management expectation.
As I said, this virus, the way it spreads is not being uniform or predictable, and we want to make sure that wherever it spreads, as we try and get it down overall, that we're there to make sure we've got the measures in place, the testing in place, the equipment in place to deal with it as soon as and as rapidly as possible. Thanks, Ben. Dominic Yateman from Metro.
Hello, First Secretary. Professor Ferguson said this morning that we will need to keep a significant level of social distancing until we have a vaccine, which we understand may take 18 months. Are you scared about discussing an exit strategy because there will be no real exit? And secondly, can I ask you, do you agree with the World Health Organization's assessment this morning, what is from the same camp as Russia and Belarus with regard to our success in controlling the outbreak?
Well, I don't think the data internationally, and Patrick talked through some of it, which shows the international comparisons would bear that out, but I haven't heard and seen the direct comments, so I'll pass judgment for the moment on that. And in relation to your question about Neil, I mean, I'll ask Patrick to comment on it, but we've been very clear that we'll take the right decisions at the right moments based on the evidence, and they may well involve a transition out of the current measures, and of course they could be calibrated in different ways. And the reason that we need to do that is based on the 5 principles that I set out. How do we do this in a reliable way which protects the NHS at the same time as allowing us to ease up on the economy and engage more in the some kind of social activities.
So I completely agree that the way out of this is vaccines and therapeutics. Those are going to be critically important. There are vaccine programs across the world, over 80 around the world. Probably 4 of those are in the clinic now. There are also therapeutic programs, both old drugs and people making new drugs. And those are going to be critically important in terms of reducing the effects of this disease and potentially reducing transmission. So vaccines and therapeutics are critically important, no question about it. And the UK, of course, is somewhere where a lot of that work is going on. Now, where we are now, as I've said, is that the social distancing measures are needed to reduce the levels right down to a low level. At that point, there may be decisions about which ones to relax and which ones not to relax. It's important to keep the R below 1, and this is all about trying to reduce contacts, particularly between households, reduce transmission, and keep the levels low across the community. So there may be a number of measures that need to continue in order to allow that to be suppressed and controlled whilst vaccines and therapeutics come along. But that's very different from saying that the measures that are in place now are the ones that need to be in place. So yes, there will be some changes, I think, that need to take place, that have already taken place around things like home working, that are going to be important to maintain that ability to break transmission. But vaccines and therapeutics are now being very actively looked at right the way across the world, including the UK.
Dominic, would you like to follow up on that?
Thank you. And just in terms of lifting the lockdown, can you give us some idea of how many daily tests will have to be available before community testing can begin?
Well, we've got the initial target of getting to 100,000, and then after that we want to keep ramping it up beyond that. And I think one of the crucial things that SAGE will do over the next couple of weeks till the end of the month is then feed back on us on the evidence of how the evidence on the impact that the measures we've taken have had on the virus, what we need to consider in relation to that evidence, in relation to measures, and how that interacts with testing and tracing. Chris, I don't know whether you want to say anything further.
I think that's exactly that.
Joe Murphy from the Evening Standard.
Thank you, First Secretary. Can I ask Sir Patrick, following up on what you said earlier, you gave us the very good news that R is less than 1 in the community, and presumably well below 1 in hospital settings, but you still seemed concerned about other settings and the position that the elderly population
requirements
is
and qualifications.
To mind. Are you tacitly
previous experience in a racial environment.
More deaths to come
previous 多态全职 part-time 兼职 level salary 薪水 apply 地方这个就 apply 申请适用应用
those numbers need to come down. There needs to be control of the infection in those sorts of settings. Currently, the proportion that they contribute to the overall picture is not entirely clear. There are measures being taken, and Chris could speak to this better than I can, to try to get on top of these issues, and they're important ones that we do need to tackle if we're going to drive the R down the way one right the way across every setting.
Joe, would you like to come back on that?
No, I'll ask something else to Chris Whitty, if I may, on the question of masks. If you could illuminate how you reached the government's line that masks are no help outside a care setting, because it's being challenged by experts like Jeremy Howard and Jeremy Hunt, who says they may reduce the spread on London racial get back to work after lockdown. Specifically, can we ask, when the government came to that conclusion, did it consider only the medical evidence about transmission, or was it also taking into account the obvious fact that there aren't at the moment enough masks to go round to the public?
Well, it's certainly the case that if there was ever a competition between healthcare workers and care workers in the front line, and people using them in situations where the risk is incredibly low, I don't think it takes a scientist or a doctor to work out that would be a very bad thing to happen. And that's one of the reasons why the World Health Organization reiterated its advice that in most settings, masks should be for healthcare workers. However, this is a very live issue that we are re-examining, and SAGE, which Patrick chairs, re-looked at that this morning. Other scientific groups are re-looking at the evidence. I think my summary today would be the evidence is weak, but the evidence of a small effect is there under certain circumstances, and what we're really trying to do is work out under what circumstances, if any, should we extend the advice, and under what circumstances should we not change that advice. But
you will be expected to reach money goals and satisfy management expectation. 必须要达到什么每个月的目标啊，然后什么管理阶层的要求。
Thank you. To Patrick Balance and Chris Whitty, your slides today show that the UK is still tracking Italy in terms of death from the outbreak. Given we were 4 weeks behind Italy at the beginning of the outbreak, can you talk us through why we're not making better progress lowering the death rate? And to the First Secretary of State, there's been a lot of talk this week from your colleagues in the Tory party about a reckoning with China. Do you think it will be business as usual with China?
In a racial environment.
Patrick, do you want to yes, I think I've been clear that the R has come down, cases look as though they've come down to hospital, there's a lag time before that translates into reduction in deaths. You can see that there's a flattening off of ICU cases, there's a potential flattening off of deaths, and I've said that probably will reach a plateau and then come down. That's very much the curve that's been followed in other countries. So I repeat what I said, I think right at the beginning, that I thought we were probably 3 or 4 weeks behind Italy.
On the question in relation to China, look, I think there absolutely needs to be a very, very deep dive after the event, a review of the lessons, including of the outbreak of the virus, and I don't think we can flinch from that at all. It needs to be driven by the science. At the same time, I think the one thing the coronavirus has taught us is the value and the importance of international cooperation. I've just been standing in for the PM on the G7 meeting, where we've been going through all of the areas where the UK is providing a leading role and working very closely with all of our international colleagues. And I have to say, there are all of these questions about the outbreak, but also we had very good cooperation with the Chinese in relation to the return of UK nationals at the outset from Wuhan, and we have on procurement of things that we need. So we ought to look at all sides of this and do it in a balanced way. But there's no doubt we can't have business as usual after this crisis, and we'll have to ask the hard questions about how it came about, how it could have been stopped earlier. Kitty, do you want to come back on any of that?
It's just Secretary, what does that mean in practice? Does that mean tariffs, or does it mean greater restrictions on Chinese investment in the UK? How do you see that playing out?
Well, what I just said was that we'd look very carefully with all of the other international partners and indeed with the WHO and the other international organisations as to how this outbreak happened and what could be done to prevent it happening in the future. I think before you get those answers, you can't really track a way forward. Bill Jacobs from the Lancashire Telegraph.
Gentlemen, the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in the Northwest is one of the worst in the country, as your slide showed. Do you have any reasons for why this is, such as deprivation or widespread long-term ill health? And are you taking special measures in the region to tackle these tragically high figures?
Superior communication skills. 沟通 communication. 高度 superior 高度 retail 销售 previous experience in the retail environment.
And actually, in the data that
Patrick showed at the beginning, what you can see is actually COVID cases in the Northwest have actually started to status 状况 restoration 恢复 previous 以前 management 管理日期到达 job category 工作种类 job industry 工作的行业 retail 销售 jewelry sales professional 首饰贩卖专业 job location job description 工作解释你的主要的 responsibility will be helping 帮助顾客他的什么首饰选择 responsibility 负责 responsibility 你主要是负责will be helping customer 顾客首饰的 selection 选择顾客设计看 restoration 归位 you will be expected to reach monthly goals and satisfy management previous experience in a retail environment 在这之前有销售经验 superior communication skills 高度的沟通技巧这想想
The critical thing is to wait till SAGE has done that analysis. They're talking about doing it by the end of the month. We'll look at it very carefully. And I don't think we can jump ahead as to what the measures might be or any of the variations of it at this point.
Stylish.
There isn't really a huge variation in timing across the country for most of this. There's a little bit. Most things are following the same sort of trajectory. And actually, most of us, right the way across the country, have adhered to the measures of social distancing in the same way. So there's much more similarity than difference, actually, in terms of the time course and trajectory of the epidemic across the country. I agree with Patrick Spider, but just on mental health, it's an absolutely key point and one that we've been from the beginning concerned about, and there are several different aspects to it, which include the risk of people increasing loneliness and include issues about delivery of mental health services across the whole country and indeed around the world in this new era of COVID-19. At the moment, we've set up quite a large number of things to try and look at how we can improve on mental health services. But you're absolutely right, it's an area where everybody who's looked at this is concerned, and there's recently been a serious look by our academic colleagues to try and work out what are the things we need to do differently as a result of this COVID epidemic for mental health than we would do under normal circumstances.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone. And that brings to a close today's press conference. Thank you very much.
the Foreign Secretary there, Dominic Raab,
appearance,
Patrick
外
Vallance
表
and Chris Whitty.
professional,
Dominic
专
Raab
业的外
making
表
it clear that
stylish,
any early
时尚的
relaxation would
stylish,
do more damage
stylish,
over the longer period.
stylish 时尚。
Day one of the lockdown, and one could not help but notice that the only shop that was open on the entire length of the Champs-Élysées in Paris was a chocolate shop.
Even as entire countries have shut down to prevent the spread of COVID-19, essential services around the world remain open. And what a country considers essential tells us a lot about its culture.
All the boulangerie and fromagerie, cheese shops, butchers and wine merchants, and indeed chocolatiers that still exist and which give France still so much of its character. All these shops have been given exemptions and can stay open, and the French, I have to say, are all mighty glad of the fact.
In the US, what counts as an essential service depends on where you live. States have made controversial choices, like gun stores. After the Trump administration released guidance supporting classifying gun shops as essential, states have allowed firearm businesses to remain open, and sales have surged to record levels. Marijuana dispensaries, both medical and recreational, have also been allowed to remain open in the states where they're legal, like Colorado, though they have adopted new social distancing measures like curbside pickup. For the past few weeks, all restaurants, bars, clubs, and pubs have been closed here in Australia. But all licenses or liquor stores, they remain open, so you can go buy a drink, but you'll have to have it at home. Toy shops are an interesting grey area. Some are closed and others are open to a limited number of customers at any given time. I know what you're thinking. Toys from shop. Well, Prime Minister Scott Morrison did say himself his wife had to go and buy their children a whole bunch of jigsaw puzzles because they were essential for his family as they changed the way they live in the next few months.
Appearance. 出现外表，出现外表 ，appearance。 Stylish and professional appearance， 时尚而且专业的外表。
They're a bit like Batman and Robin's and Batlight, but last month, strict quarantine measures placed on the country's main island Luzon meant all public transport was banned. However, a popular young local mayor in Manila, Vico Soto, allowed trikes to be used by medical workers. But the next day, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte warned local officials not to break quarantine rules. But now, President Duterte's daughter Sara, mayor of Davao City, has also allowed trikes to be used. Her exemption being that the city doesn't fall under Luzon quarantine measures.
A passion for fashion, appearance.
For the first time in the history of the year, its extensive railway network, considered a lifeline for the country, has been halted. But halting these trains that carry more than 23 million passengers every day has had a fallout. Lots of daily wage earners have been stranded in the cities without money, food or shelter. The government's now making arrangements for them. Interestingly, the information technology sector has been exempted from what is otherwise a stringent shutdown with a view to keep networks that are crucial to communication, banking and governance. Different countries give different advice when it comes to masks. Some even want you to make your own.
That easy.
But what does the science say? Mask on, mask off. Well, the World Health Organization, which is made up of thousands of doctors, public health specialists and scientists from around the world, looks at all the evidence on this subject regularly. It says healthy people do not need to wear a face mask when they go about their daily business. Why not? It says in this situation, there's no evidence to show that masks stop you from getting coronavirus. Masks themselves can actually become contaminated and infect you. For instance, if you touch something and then touch your mask, or even your face. Also, masks give a false sense of security, so you may feel better protected than you actually are. And they say masks may make you less likely to wash your hands or practice social distancing. And if too many people are buying masks, there aren't going to be enough for those who really need them. So who should wear a mask? Enter the health and care workers of the world. Masks like these should be prioritised for them, so they can safely look after sick people. According to the WHO, you should also wear a mask if you're at home with coronavirus symptoms or looking after someone who is ill at home. while you're in the same room as them.
Medical
but you should make sure you wear them
benefits.
properly and dispose of them safely. Does everyone agree with the WHO?
Medical
Well, no. Slovakia and the Czech Republic, for example, have made it illegal to leave your home without a mask. In other countries, wearing masks all the time is just the done thing. This is not really to do with protecting yourself, but protecting others from you. This idea is supported by some scientists, but it's not supported by the WHO, nor is it backed by the British government. Can I make my own mask? Well, in America, where there's been a shortage of medical masks, people are making their own out of old clothes. But the WHO says it doesn't know whether homemade masks work or not. There's not enough evidence to make a decision, but it's something it's still looking into. So what's the best way to stop yourself from catching coronavirus when you leave your house? It's still all about that hand washing and practicing social distancing.
Caution is in the air in this Egyptian public hospital.
Qualification,
and patients were cleared from the room as disinfection gets underway.
Fashion, 流行， 这是怎么念啊？
Dozens of them have recently tested positive
accessory.
We spoke to a doctor in a public hospital who didn't want to be identified.
Accessory. 饰品及珠宝。热情是什么？流行饰品及珠宝。饰品就是附件嘛，也可以，但这是附件饰品。Accessory.
Before it became a hot spot for coronavirus. Over a week ago, nearly 20 medical staff were infected. Officially registered coronavirus cases suggest that the infection rate has not spiked yet. But even before the country gets to this grim milestone, doctors are warning there isn't enough personal protective equipment or medical tests.
Accessory.
According to the World Bank, there is nearly one hospital bed for every 1,000 Egyptians, and local statistics say there are around 2 doctors for every 1,000 patients. We managed to get this video from a quarantine hospital where media access is highly restricted. There are nearly 30 of them, and they are said to be well equipped. The doctor in the yellow suit is Muhammad. He worked at another hospital that had around 160 patients. His words largely echo what the government says.
المستلزمات على اعلى مستوى بتتوفر اول ما دخلت. لما العدد بدا يكبر جامد جدا 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 اللوجستيات بتاعت الامدادات اتهزت. يعني مثلا زي ان احنا نقول مثلا احنا كنا بنستهلك 500 ماسك في اليوم مثلا وموجود غيرهم ففجاه استهلكنا 1000 او 1500 ماسك. بس تم تدارك الموقف حتى يعني بعديها بيومين تم ارسال ضعف الكميه.
As the pandemic ravaged other countries, Egypt has sent medical supplies to Italy twice. The move was criticized for coming while hospitals at home are trying to cope with shortages, but the government disagrees.
انما دي رساله سياسيه لدعم الدول في حاجه زي كده، يعني ايطاليا عندها مشكله كبيره وبالتالي انت محتاجه تمد يد العمده، ما انا في يوم من الايام هحتاج، يعني وارد ان احتاج في الازمه دي او في غيرها.
But the bustling city comes to a standstill at night due to a nationwide curfew. Egyptians have not seen the worst of coronavirus yet. But with a population of over 100 million and the poorly funded healthcare system, the scenario can be scary if numbers swell. BBC News, Cairo.
Well, the question of how will this end is, of course, one most of us will be asking since it started. Our visitor Ross is back with us. Ross, they've got a look at how some European countries may seek to return to something like normal life.
Yes, thanks, Lewis. We've heard a lot, haven't we, about demands for exit strategies, and that's not unreasonable. Severe lockdowns are in place across much of Europe, and they were never intended as a long-term plan.
Requirements and qualifications, previous experience in a retail environment. 在这之前有销售的经验 ，superior communication skills， 高度的沟通技巧 ，stylish and professional appearance， 时尚且专业的外表 ，passion for fashion accessories and jewelry， 对流行饰品珠宝有热忱。Saturdays a must， 星期六必须上班。Benefits。 福利 benefits 福利 bonus 红利 medical benefits medical 医疗的 paid vacation 年假 paid vacation 年假 medical benefits medical benefits accessories 饰品附件
Its response at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis was really messy.
You will be
expected to before you start lifting your lockdowns, can you please coordinate and don't even think about it unless the number of infections has been going down for a sustained amount of time, unless your public health system is able to deal with the spike of new infections, and unless you have the testing capacity in place to trace new infections and protect the general public, who would then be out and about. What the hope here is to prevent a new wave of infections across Europe. This is not about getting back to normal, it's about the targeted easing of restrictions and reintroducing them again, if necessary, if there's a new wave of infections.
Well, Germany has announced that some small shops will be opening next week and that schools can reopen from May the 4th. It has also, though, extended social distancing rules until May the 3rd, and it's strongly recommending the wearing of face masks in public. Now, bear in mind that Germany has a much lower death rate than many other European countries. It has more than 132,000 confirmed cases and just over 3,500 deaths. It's believed the high rate of testing in Germany has allowed officials to better manage the spread of the virus. Here's the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, on the decision to reopen schools.
We can only start slowly with schools, step by step after May 4. It must be in smaller groups, there must be a plan for school buses, a plan for break time, so it will be a huge logistical effort and needs intensive preparation. I know how much more sacrifice this means for parents, but I believe it's necessary if we're saying we have to live with the virus during this pandemic.
Plus Germany, other countries have started introducing changes too. Denmark, for example, has reopened nurseries and primary schools. These are pictures of the Prime Minister visiting one of them. Now, she's saying she understands that some parents might decide to still keep their children at home even though the schools are open. Denmark has nearly 6,900 confirmed cases and over 300 deaths. But the government's decision is informed by the fact that the number of new cases is now falling. Here's Adrian Murray in Copenhagen.
At the moment, all other regulations, restrictions are remaining in place until around May 10th. Denmark was an early mover. It announced a raft of them around March 11th. That included shutting the borders, limiting gatherings to a maximum of 10. People have been working from home, but also a number of businesses have had to close. That's included hairdressers, gyms, bars and restaurants. Now, those will remain closed for the next couple of weeks. However, yesterday, the Prime Minister was sounding more optimistic, and she did suggest she might be able to move forward sooner than originally planned with lifting some of those restrictions that remain in place.
Now, with much of Europe on lockdown, as you may know, Sweden has been an outlier. It's chosen not to introduce nationwide restrictions. For example, here's Stockholm this week, no social distancing, as you can see, and cafes and restaurants have remained open. But the number of deaths and infections in Sweden is now higher than we're seeing in neighbouring countries, Finland and Norway, which do have restrictions in place. Well, there are now nearly 12,000 cases in Sweden and over 1,200 deaths. Go back 2 weeks ago, that figure was 282. Here's Sweden's chief epidemiologist.
The one thing that has not worked so well, and that's why the death toll has increased so quickly, is the introduction of the disease into elderly homes, and that's our big worry right now. We have always said that it's very important to protect the vulnerable population in Sweden is mainly the above 70, 75s. And I think what has been shown to us is the weakness of the structure we have for elderly homes in Sweden. It's not the basic strategy that we see has failed. It's really the elderly homes' possibilities to stop the introduction of the disease into the elderly homes.
Well, Sweden's a good example of how each country has taken its own path, and though the EU is seeking to fashion a unified response, each country will also select its own exit strategy, and they're already under pressure to do so. Take the UK, for example. Here's the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, speaking to the BBC earlier.
We do need to take the public with us. We need the public to comply, and therefore they need to know that the government has a strategy for what comes next. And they need to know the government's planning for that. And I think if there's transparency and openness, you get the trust of the public. And if you get the trust of the public, it's like the compliance levels will go up. And that is a very good thing, because what the government is doing now to keep the infection rate down is the right thing, and we should support that.
Well, for its part, the government says talking about an exit before the virus has reached its peak risks confusing the public. And I should say, when Keir Starmer was pushed on exactly when he'd reopened schools, he declined to give a date, and therein lies the rub. Every exit strategy is going to be graded. The lockdowns won't suddenly stop. Their severity will be reduced bit by bit. And then the level at which restrictions are pitched will inevitably be guided by how the rates of infection and fatalities react to that easing of the restrictions. This is going to shift around, which is maybe why governments are proving reluctant to give us too many details, which they fear will then be quoted back at them down the track. Now, if you do want to understand the options available to governments in the middle of this, I'd really recommend this article. The headlines are Pandemic Summer. It's written by Ed Yong in The Atlantic, and Ed details what all experts are telling us, that options are actually quite limited. In his words, the only viable endgame is to play whack-a-mole with the coronavirus, suppressing it until a vaccine can be produced. With luck, he says, that will take 18 to 24 months. The point here being that when people talk about exit strategies, that just means exiting the strictest of lockdowns, the lockdowns that many of us are experiencing at the moment. As for a strategy of getting us back to life as normal, well, governments and scientists will have plans and ideas, but even they will admit these can be no more than educated guesses at this stage. And Lewis, there's also a lot of information we should flag on the political debates around the exit strategies, both in the UK and elsewhere, via the BBC News website.
Yeah, that's right. Playing whack-a-mole with the pandemic is some image, isn't it? In the United States, almost 27,000 people have died from COVID-19, making it the country worst affected by the outbreak. But it's the words and actions of President Trump still dominating the headlines. He's been heavily criticised for halting funding for the World Health Organization. Here's how it started.
Today I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization while a review is conducted to assess the World Health Organization's role in severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus. Everybody knows what's going on there.
While world leaders, diplomats, doctors have criticised the announcement, this is what the World Health Organization itself had to say earlier.
This is a time for all of us to be united in our common struggle against a common threat, a dangerous enemy. When we're divided, the virus exploits the cracks between us. We're committed to serving the world's people and to accountability for the resources with which we're entrusted.
And this is the reaction from the editor of the Lancet Medical Journal.
Well, the World Health Organization's primary role is to defend the health of the world's population. And a crime against humanity is a systematic attempt to hurt the health and well-being of a population. President Trump has clearly committed that crime.
Well, as well as accusing the WHO of a cover-up, President Trump said it failed to adequately assess the outbreak when it first emerged in the city of Wuhan, and accused it of trusting China too much.
The WHO willingly took China's assurances to face value, and they took it just at face value, and defended the actions of the Chinese government, even praising China for its so-called transparency. I don't think so.
Well, let's hear China's reaction to that.
The current global pandemic is grave. This is a critical moment. The US decision will weaken the WHO's ability to handle the pandemic and will undermine the international cooperation against COVID-19. All nations, including the United States, will suffer from the impact of the decision.
And Kerry Allen has been monitoring Chinese social media for us.
China and the US had a very difficult relationship going back to early January when we were first hearing about this virus. And it was very much the case that, we were hearing Donald Trump calling this the Chinese virus, that Chinese media were wanting to give the impression that the US was not cooperating, it was pointing the finger. And so now that the US has suspended funding for the World Health Organization, this really increases this line in China. And people are very angry about this. They're seeing the US as not being cooperative, very much Donald Trump distancing himself from everything and wanting to point blame rather than helping other countries. And so now I'm seeing a lot of lines on social media platforms like Sina Weibo, with people saying that he clearly doesn't care about other people's feelings, and that there's a lot of anger towards him and a lot of concern for the US people.
And a bit of context here, the US has the highest number of cases and deaths worldwide, and there's been criticism of the federal government's handling of the crisis. So this is also political. A blame game ahead of this year's US presidential election. Well, let's bring in Anthony Zerka, who's in Washington. Hi, Anthony, good to see you. So it's always slightly uncomfortable talking about this through a political lens, isn't it? We had so many deaths there in the US, but this is an election issue.
It is, and that's simply the reality here. It's politicians who are handling this crisis, and so it's by nature going to be a political debate when it comes down to it. And as you mentioned, Donald Trump has been getting a lot of criticism for his handling of the U.S. response to this virus, downplaying its severity early on, whether he did enough in February to prepare various hospitals and healthcare systems to deal with the patients. And so now you've seen him attempt to shift some of this blame, most recently to the WHO, but he's also talked about China, about governors in the states not doing enough, or Democrats in Congress not coming up with a good enough legislative solution. So that's the reality. But if you look back, Donald Trump himself at one point was praising China's response for it, saying that they were being transparent. So the same thing he's accusing the WHO of right now, he actually engaged in similar type of language earlier on this year.
And viewers may remember, Anthony, that Donald Trump wanted to reopen the US by Easter. That deadline clearly has been and gone. Is there a timeline now?
Well, actually, what we're talking about right now is a May 1st deadline. That's what Donald Trump appears to want. That's what he's telling his administration officials to try to come up with. But the reality is it's going to be very difficult to open the whole nation on May 1st. The conditions in various states are very different. And the bottom line is that state governors are the ones who close things down. They are the ones who are going to have to decide when to open things up again. So that's why you're seeing various associations of states like California, Oregon, and Washington on the West Coast New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and others on the East Coast trying to figure out the best way to do it. And they're looking at a step-by-step process where they can control the spread of the virus so they don't get some sort of a renewed peak in the spread and more deaths, more hospitalizations when they start to ease back on this restrictions. But I think all the politicians are looking at November, looking at the election, and they realize that they want the economy to try to rebound at some point soon.
Yeah, fascinating the power balances going on there. Anthony Zerka, thank you very much for that. Right, let's assess the substance now, Donald Trump's criticism of the WHO. How valid is it? Well, I'm going to get some help here, thankfully, from a familiar face. There he is, Roz Atkins, has been off Outside Source for the last few weeks, but he's joining us from his home to look into this side of the story. Good to see you again, Roz.
Yeah, good to see you, Lewis. Thanks very much. Yes, my family and I are going to be staying at home for a while, so it's good to be back on Outside Source, if not in the newsroom quite yet. And let's have a detailed look at the WHO and Donald Trump's criticism of it, starting with the World Health Organization itself. It's a UN agency, it's based in Geneva, and it has an annual budget of over $2.5 billion. Now that comes in part from member countries and in part from philanthropic donations. America's the largest donor. It pledges $400 million annually, though I should say it's in arrears on its contributions. The second largest contributor, well, that's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And there's now a sharp divide between these top two donors. We have Donald Trump saying US money is suspended because the WHO has worsened the outbreak with mismanagement and has covered for Chinese mistakes. And then we have Bill Gates. Well, he's been tweeting this, arguing that Mr. Trump's move is dangerous and adding that if the WHO's work is stopped, no other organisation can replace it. Now, clearly the two men don't agree here, but their analyses don't necessarily cancel each other out, as you might imagine, and here's why. It's certainly true that some of the WHO's statements have raised a few eyebrows. For example, in January, it said there was no evidence that COVID-19 could be transmitted from human to human, but it was already happening. Also, in late January, it declared a public health emergency but said severe travel restrictions were not necessary. Countries then introduced them all the same. It also said there was no need for all of us to wear face masks, and then weeks later said it was reviewing that advice. We can also say it's true that the WHO has been effusive in its praise for China's response, and there's been no equivalent severity in its criticism of China's failure to speak publicly when it first knew of the virus, or of China's intimidation of doctors who did speak out. Now, critics say the WHO has been too soft on China for political reasons. The WHO says, look, it has to be diplomatic to get China to cooperate. It's also worth pointing out, the WHO advises member states. It can't instruct them. The most crucial decisions taken during this crisis haven't been taken by the WHO, but by individual countries such as China and, of course, the US. There are a couple of additional issues here. The first is America's place on the international stage. This is a tweet we should take note of from the former US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. She served under President Obama. Here she is imagining President Putin thinking of Russia's efforts to help Donald Trump win the 2016 election and seeing this WHO decision. She suggests this latest decision is a destruction of US credibility beyond Mr. Putin's wildest dreams. But actually, this decision sits comfortably within Donald Trump's foreign policy. He's taken the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, a major free trade deal with Pacific nations, and its military commitments in northern Syria. The list is a long one. And we know he's suspicious of supranational bodies like the WHO, and he's suspicious of how much money that America pays, in his eyes, to sort out other people's problems. So this WHO decision is entirely in line with that thinking. So if we combine all of that with those political calculations ahead of the US election that, Lewis, you were discussing with Anthony Zerka, we start to get towards a better understanding of this announcement from the President.
Thanks so much for that, Roz. Important to dig into the nuance there. Fascinating stuff. Thanks very much.
Certo non possiamo sopravvivere a 5-6 mesi di chiusura. È tutto come l'abbiamo lasciato l'ultima notte. messo dentro tutta la nostra vita, non abbiamo il tempo neanche di piangere, neanche di disperarci perché è finita un'avventura. Si parla addirittura di una riapertura totale, quindi senza restringimenti per l'autunno. I politici al momento non ci hanno dato una mission di quello che accadrà, ci hanno dato solamente delle regole. We can't have concerts, we can't have cinema.
What about bars and restaurants?
Now it's impossible to imagine that the restaurants can reopen. Until the discovery of a vaccine, it's impossible to imagine that you can return to a normal life.
How busy does it get?
It's good. The last year.
Nothing.
Non possiamo sapere quando l'emergenza sarà finita e quando sarà possibile riaprire l'attività, perché di fatto queste sono attività aggregative. Avendo una modalità di lavoro diversa, quindi distanziamento sociale, quindi impossibilità di aggregazione, e noi non potremmo sostenere gli stessi affitti, le stesse tasse, le stesse spese in generale.
I bar, le trattorie, i ristoranti non vanno più in Italia.
No one can leave for the mainland and no one can come in.
Approximately 1/2 of the island population is infected.
The infection rate per capita is one of the highest in the world.